paths and navigation.
All right.
And JSON.
So I'm Alan Painter. I work for HSB. Before I used to work for HSBC France. They changed their name to HSBC Continental Europe. I grew up in Texas, and I moved from the United States to France about 30 years ago. In 30 years, I've gotten to learn a little bit of French. And one of the things that I've learned the most about in learning French is I've learned something about English. So a lot of things about English. And I think in some ways we can learn, by studying JSONPath, we can learn some things about XPath with respect to handling JSON. Now, obviously Michael Kay has just shown us the future, and it's going to make things much simpler. And there's a couple of spots where you'll be able to fill in the things that I've left sort of blank with some of the new information that Michael Kay has shown us. And I'm very excited to be able to use that in the near future. I hope it's in the near future. So I've used JSONPath for about 10 years within a testing framework for APIs. And you see that quite a bit. I was just curious, how many people here have used JSONPath? Show of hands. See a few. OK. Just want to talk about JSONPath for a second. Let's see, is it that one? All right, so JSONPath first was proposed in 2007 by Stefan Gössner in a paper on the internet. He said that XML has excellent tools for handling extraction of data. And so we need something for JSON as well. So he proposed XPath for JSON, JSONPath. So that's where it started. There's a site in GitHub that's written by Christoph Bergmer, and it is a comparison of the 50 different implementations of JSONPath in 20 different languages. This was used as part of the run-up to the new standard. Here we're seeing that there's about 200 different JSONPath queries with the results compared from all of these different implementations. And so we can sort of see that we're just trying to determine what is the consensus. So we can see an X here for, well, this one's not in the consensus and this one is. Or we see we've got a downward arrow to show, well, this one is not in the tendency, this one is in the tendency, but there's not a clear consensus either. There's also some errors. There's a lot of divergence in the results here. So that was part of the reason that the standard came up. So JSONPath is also very widely adopted. You see it in Kubernetes, the very popular container orchestration tool. You see it in Amazon Web Services as part of their serverless offering with step functions. The Google Compute Platform, also known as Google Cloud, in their Apigee, so that's for their API management mechanism. You can see that they do have XPath, but it's for XML. And then we've got some JSONPath, it's for JSON. So there's sort of this idea that XPath doesn't work for JSON here. And so this year, February 2024, but it's been going on for a couple of years, there's a working group at the IETF, the International Engineering Task Force, that came out with a new proposed standard, 9535. If you go into YouTube, you can see that the IETF, they have a channel. If you query JSONPath on the channel, you find there's more than 20 videos. So they've had about 20 working group meetings. There's a couple of hours of video for each meeting. It's fascinating to watch. I've watched about 10 minutes of it. So they have documented all of their working group. And there's a new Wikipedia page. Now, that's a little interesting because JSONPath has been around for a long time. Wikipedia, if a thing is a thing, it's in Wikipedia, but it's just shown up this year. So there's been a lot of effort for JSONPath this year. And what I wanted to do is bring this in and show some commonality with the creation of XML. And so one of the things I've done here is I've highlighted Tim Bray's name because he appears, of course, in the XML 1.1 and the 1.0 recommendations of the W3C. But he also appears in the JSON, the IETF JSON data interchange specifications. So this is following on of Crockford's definition of JSON, which was not a proposed standard, but was just information about the media type. And so in 2017, RFC 8259 became standard. And that is an internet standard. There's 99 internet standards. There's about 10,000 RFCs. There's 99 standards. There's things like Tim Berners-Lee's URI, that's a standard. HTTP is a standard. TCP is a standard. This one is an internet standard. And then this year, a new proposed standard for JSONPath. So one of the things that I noticed is that JSONPath appears in 2024. XPath 1 is 1999, so there's been a quarter of a century between the two. I think that's a long time, even for standards. So let's take just a quick look at JSON. In the standard 90, 7 different types of data. The 2 that are structured, objects and arrays. We've got numbers, strings, those are the primitives that are variable, and then we've got 3 literals, including null, true, false. The standard tells you null doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean something's absent. There's no semantics behind it, so it's a very simple standard. That's maybe one of the reasons why it's been accepted. It's simple enough to where everyone agrees to it. Okay, RFC 9535, that's the new JSONPath proposed standard, has a very simple objective. It says we're extracting values from within a given JSON value. So we're not trying to create an expression language that can do everything. We're not trying to recreate XPath. We're trying to create something very simple for extracting given values from a current JSON value. So let's take a look at that. They defined the execution environment. This is a bit simpler than the XPath execution environment, where there's no in-context namespaces, variables, and there's simply a single query argument. So this is some JSON value, some arbitrary JSON value. There's just one of them. And then we've got this query expression, and that's the JSONPath expression. And we're going to produce an output node list of JSON values. So it's a node list. That's not part of JSON. It's kind of like sequences. It's a list of things, but they're not an array or something else that you can recognize in JSON. And then we've got the location of it. This sounds very similar to what Michael Kay was talking about. So it says that it's always a pair. We've got the value, and then we're also saying, well, where is that value in the query argument? And this is a unique, it's normalized. They call it a normalized path. It tells you exactly where that value was in the query argument. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the query expression. JSONPath says that there's 3 things in JSONPath. There's identifiers, segments, and selectors. So those are pretty easy. The identifiers, the $, is just sort of like the source document to an XSLT transformation. The $, says this is the entire query argument. This is the root of the query argument. Okay, and there's one other identifier which is only usable within something that looks like an XPath predicate. So it's for the context node when we're working with a list of input predicates, and we're using the filter expression for it. So we'll take a look at that. So segments, this tells us how we're going to traverse the tree of the JSON argument. Either we're going to, so a selector, the canonical selector always has the square brackets around it. For the descendant, it has 2 dots in front of it. So you can either choose children or you can choose descendants. And Stefan Gester says it is based upon the XPath path operator with a single or a double slash. So you can see that in this case, this is an array, so we're choosing the 2 children. Let's say that the segment presents the 2 children to the selectors, and maybe those selectors will select them. Or the descendant segment is going to present all of the all of the descendant elements, okay, and maybe the selector will select those. One of the things that you cannot select the keys in JSONPath. That's not a valid JSON value. You can select the whole map that contains all of the entries, but you cannot select those keys. All right, and so JSONPath looks then like it always starts off with $, has to be the first character, no spaces before. Then we have a series of selectors. Here we're seeing them canonically. There's also a shorthand. And it says that, so after the first selector, the first, segment, could select the first two, these two children. The second one then could select at a lower depth. The third segment could go all the way to depth 3. Depth 3 has no children because it's a primitive. And so this fourth selector necessarily can't select anything. So you're always selecting downwards. So within those segments, you can have a list of selectors. There's at least one. And there's 5 kinds of selectors, and I think these are mostly pretty obvious. The name selector is going to be for choosing the value associated with a key within a map. In the XPath world, they call that a member name with a member value. In the JSONPath world, wildcards, we're going to choose all of the members of an array or all the members of the member values of an object. So once again, not the keys, just the values. We've got the index, so this one's pretty easy, just an index into an array. We can't have a negative value. What that happens is the negative value gets added to the size of the array, and so you're indexing from the end of the array in that case. So -1 means the last one in the array. There's also this array slice. I can get a list of indices with a start and an end and by step. I can also do negative steps. And the one that's most interesting is probably the filter selector. Here, now the filter selector is introduced by the question mark. So this, and this is interesting. We'll see this in a second. So when I've got the question mark inside of the segment bracket, that means it's a filter selector, and that means that we're going to have an expression to choose that is going to be applied to the context value that precedes of the values that precede that segment. So it looks very much like an XPath predicate. That's within here. This is the only place where we can use that context node. And it's also the only place where we get to use this list of functions. So there's a few functions here, like I can ask for length, and that works with strings and arrays and with members. I can ask for the count. That works exactly like an XPath. I can match on a regular expression. Regular expression comes from XML schema definition, so they make a reference to that. I think that Michael K. recommended that to them. Let's see, we can search on a substring, and we can also, this value, so the expressions within the filter selector can be either comparisons or existence. So a comparison is going to compare the values of those nodes with a given value. And then the existence is just going to tell me whether or not there's something there. And I can use a not for the existence, for instance. So this value is really used in case I've got on the right, on one of the comparisons, if I have a path that could potentially produce more than one value. Value says, take the list of values that's produced from it. If there's exactly one, that's the value that we'll provide to the comparison expression. And if there's more than one, you say there's nothing. Or if there is nothing as well, there's also nothing. All right, and then there's a couple of shorthands. They're entirely equivalent to the canonical versions. So I can use .name instead of putting it inside of the square braces, and I can use the wildcards like that. Those are the only shorthands. So if I want to do some comparisons to JSONPath to XPath 3.1, I didn't go all the way to XPath 4. They look very similar, I would say. So on the left-hand side, I'm saying I'm choosing the value associated with a key in a map. XPath 3.1, I've got different ways of doing that. I can use the question mark lookup operator. I can use the function form. I'm passing the key in as the argument to the function. And then I can use the map-get function. And arrays are pretty much the same thing. There isn't a shorthand for arrays in JSONPath. So JSONPath is zero-based, so I need to look for the 6th index in XPath because we're 1-based. But that's pretty much the same look. -1, well, I can look at last. This is where Michael K's XPath 4 is going to come in handy because this says I'm going to descend through the tree, and every time I find an array, I'm going to take the value of the fourth element there. I didn't really have, there's not a shorthand in XPath 3.1 for that, so obviously the question mark would do quite nicely here. Otherwise, I can write a function that does the recursive descent of the tree, and then I can provide a higher order function selector for making some sort of selection with that in XPath 3.1. I can write a function for producing the indices here that correspond to this slice definition, and then I can apply it to that to an array. I have to make sure I add 1 to the index because it's 1-based. The wildcard operator, the wildcard selector, looks pretty much the same. I'm wondering if there's not some cross-pollination there. And otherwise, so one of the things you can do is within a segment, you can put multiple selectors. So this is a list. What it says is when you're traversing in the segment, when you get to that value, you're going to apply all of these selectors to it. So there's 4 of them. So what I'm saying is I'm going to get 4 times the value of the 0 positioned element in that array. So I can do that in XPath pretty easy. And I can also do that with the wildcards. I'm saying I'll copy everything in the array or the object. Again, for objects, it's just the values, it's not the keys. And then I can also say, well, I want 4 copies of it. So this is the store object that Michael K. was presenting. I put it in the margin, but it's the same one. It's in the standard. Here's some JSONPath expressions that are also in the standard that operate on this object. And I've got the XPath equivalents. I think they look pretty similar. One thing that is deceptively similar, let's see if I can do this, is this question mark here in JSONPath. That means I'm introducing a filter selector. Now this question mark over there, and I didn't do the same thing I did up here. This one has an implicit dot current context. And you don't have to put it in there. If you don't, it looks exactly the same, but these are 2 very different semantics. This one just says, I'm introducing a filter selector, and this one says, I'm looking for the value associated with the key price here. But then they look very, very similar, I think. And then I can also, Michael K., you had the example of searching for ISBN. We've got ISBN searching for it, or not ISBN. So they look also very similar. So one of the things that I've run into in JSONPath, this is from the JSONPath compliance test suite. There are about 500 examples in there. This one really threw me. I had to look at it for a long time. And that's because of nothing. So one of the things is nothing is different from an empty sequence in some ways, okay? And I won't go too much into that. But this value says, so here we're saying I want to select all of the elements within values for which this expression is true, okay? That the length of the value associated with the A key is equal to the value of this expression, okay? Now it turns out this expression here says do a recursive sent and find the values associated with the C keys. And so there's 2 of them, there's D and there's CD. Because there's 2 of them, value returns nothing. So then the length is going to be applied to each context node here. Well, when I apply it to this object, well, A has a length of 2, that's not nothing, so it doesn't match. There's no A here, and so it is nothing, so that does match. And then this one, the A is null, and the value, or the length of null is nothing, so that one matches as well. So the result expression is this. It seems quite surprising. It's very different from the effective Boolean value. In XPath, if you have 2 expressions that both provide an empty sequence and you compare them, what's the result? Is it true or false? It's the empty sequence, that's right. So that would not give you true. So, but in this case, nothing does match, and so really nothing really kind of matters in this case. So what can you do in JSONPath you can't do in XPath 3.1 with JSON? And I haven't found anything. I think there may be nothing, especially since if you did find sort of a corner case, you could always write a function, a user-defined function to do something with it. What can you do in XPath 3.1 with JSON that you can't do in JSONPath? Well, there's a lot of things. JSONPath is not for arbitrary evaluation. It's not for, you can't pull out just the list of member keys. There's no user-defined functions. You can't do any sort of transformation. So it's in a very different space. That means the JSONPath is really much, much simpler. So some of my conclusions, so I'll just skip ahead for one. This is one of my footnotes, is that JSONPath Wikipedia page. So it showed up in March. It was on the working group mailing list that I was following. I took a look at it, and one of the sections was talking about alternative to JSONPath. And they mentioned JSONic. They did not mention XPath 3.1. So I added it. It's Wikipedia. If you don't like what I added, you can change it, and I'll probably change it back. But this told me that even those that were developing the JSONPath specification, they were not aware, or perhaps were not aware, that XPath 3.1 could actually do a very good query of JSON. And XPath 4 is going to be excellent. So for my conclusions, I think that JSONPath and XPath 3.1 are often very similar. And I think that they read in the same way, sometimes in surprisingly similar ways. That JSONPath is not going to replace XPath 3.1 for transformations on JSON. So JSON's everywhere. We have to accept that. That's great. I think we need to be more vocal about the fact that XPath 3.1 handles JSON really well, and XPath 4 is going to handle it even better. And that people should pay attention to XPath in the JSON space and not say, well, XPath is just for XML. And so one of the other things is, so this is a new standard. There are a lot of existing implementations of JSONPath. What I think is going to be interesting is to see what's going to happen to the existing implementations. There are a lot of them. A lot of people use it. It's very well adopted. Is there going to be some alignment? How is this new standard going to affect the existing base? Just have one other footnote. And this was, I think, one of the reviewers, I think it was you, Mike, okay, mentioned that he was interested in what this location was about. So I was looking at this. What is this location? So the original Gessner implementation and specification, you could say, well, I could ask for either the value outputs in a node list, or I could ask for a list of locations. And so you could get one or the other. If you do it twice, then you'd have both, obviously. And I've found at least one other implementation that does that. And the specification itself does use location in their output, in their example output. It's good to illustrate just where it was coming from rather than you taking the value and try to guess where it is in the query argument. The compliance test suite, on the other hand, does not give us a list of output locations. So I'm wondering how much of a requirement it is if even the compliance test suite doesn't have that. So I think that XPath has a lot of 3.1 and now 4 really is a very good competitor for JSONPath. So I think that we need to maybe get more adoption and more recognition for that. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan. And we have space for questions. Stephen, over there.
Not so much a question as a comment. You asked about whether there'd be convergence. And if I look at Seriot's parsing JSON test set, he says I did not find two libraries that exhibit this very same behavior just for parsing JSON. I would be pessimistic about convergence.
Okay. For parsing JSON, so the specification does say that the JSON input does need to be conformant to 8259 or standard 90.
Yeah.
So
So this was a guy who was a guy who created a test set for JSON for parsers, and he doesn't find convergence there.
that's surprising because the hallmark of JSON is the simplicity in parsing it.
Exactly, and one of the surprising aspects.
There is a question over there.
Yes, several comments. Thanks very much for the talk. I have sort of tried to follow the JSONPath development and occasionally comment on what they were doing, and so there has been some cross-fertilization, and the JSON location concept in the spec was certainly informative and influential. So
okay.
that is an idea that has, crossed the channel in between the two communities, and of course there are people who've been involved, like Tim Bray, who know both areas well as well. On the issue, there's a general thing about standardization, which is it can come too early or too late. Standardization 20 years after the first implementation often does fail, because the existing variants are so well entrenched that it's very hard to bring them into line and to find the business case for changing your implementation to conform to a standard, especially if other people don't appear to be doing that. But I think one point I would make that perhaps you didn't highlight is that JSONPath does have many of the advantages of XPath 1.0. I mean, Tim Bray, I think, is on record as saying the reason XML succeeded is that you can implement it in a weekend. And the same can be said for XPath 1.0, and the same can be said for JSONPath. It's a small language. It can be implemented by people in their spare time. And that's often a very great impetus to making something successful. XPath 3.1 and XPath 4.0 implementations are thin on the ground because they are expensive to produce, and that's an important factor.
Okay, we have a question from Peter.
With invisible XML, with invisible XML,
Hi, Alan.
Was looking.
Thanks for your
Hey,
talk.
Peter.
So you're mentioning that JSONic is mentioned on the Wikipedia page, and JSONic attempts to do XPath for JSON. So would effectively JSONic be the solution for the JSON community?
I couldn't answer to that. I definitely couldn't.
Would that be? I would expect that to be conformant to XPath 3.1 and using the syntax that JSON people like.
So I don't know enough about JSONic to answer that, so I'm sorry. I just, in terms of alternatives, I was surprised to see JSONic put there and not XPath 3.1, since I think JSONic is not a standard. It's an implementation, but it's not a standard in the W3C sense. So I would have thought that we would have included that. But don't you think that means that there's not enough recognition that XPath 3.1 handles JSON?
I think the syntactic differences make it hard for the other community to understand XML.
Okay, well, but so you said the syntactic differences make it hard. I tried to argue that they're very close. So I think we don't agree.
And the last question.
do we expect YML path?
Ooh, now that's a better question. So I personally use YAML a lot. I really hate it. And I haven't seen anything that really produces YAML the way that things produce XML. It's not really part of a pipeline. It's a source document. So I'm not sure if we're really going to be doing something. But YAML, of course, it creates JSON. It's a different serialization of JSON, but the outcome of it is JSON. So we could definitely use JSONPath or XPath 3.1 or JSONic on the output of YAML. So I think it's quite applicable.
Okay, thank you very much again.